Hi everyone, Kalem from Redfoot Levelling here, and today I'm going to show you how to measure up and qualify what kind of brackets you need on a caravan for our AUTOLIFT systems. So the first thing you want to do is get the van and the chassis parallel to the ground, as level as you possibly can, so preferably on a concrete slab like a warehouse, because what we want to do is make sure that when it is parallel we get correct measurements from when the jacks are swinging down, otherwise they might hit the ground or you might have clearance issues, might be too high. So the best thing first, as you can see we've done here, get it perfectly level as we can. And then now we're going to measure the chassis to ground measurements. So what you'll want to do is go up to, you will have an A-frame as well. So you have the A-frame and above that you will have the chassis. So I'll just measure from the bottom of the A-frame here on this van, just for an example. And you'll see I'm sitting at about 375 mil from bottom of chassis to ground. Now, why that's important is because this jack closed length is 375 mil. So if I were to mount that to the bottom of the chassis, it'd be hitting the ground. So what we need to know is how high and what kind of brackets can I use on this model and this chassis here. We're going to do the same thing on the rear, because you'll know on the front we have an A-frame which will sit below the main chassis of the van, and on the rear we won't have the A-frame. So sometimes there is some reinforced section that will go further back, but on most caravans you'll just have a standard chassis running all the way back and then the A-frame which will sit lower at the front. So on the rear it's going to be a slightly different measurement here. So what we'll see is from the chassis to ground on the rear, we're actually sitting at 510 mil, which is quite a big variation between the front. So before we want to pick a bracket to figure out what is going to be the best suit, we also want to watch out for anything that's going to be an obstacle or potentially the jack might hit when it's swinging up. Perfect example on this van right here is they have a rear door. So some vans will have the door on the front, this one has it just behind the rear axle. And because we want to have our jacks as close to the rear axle as possible for departure clearances, if you're going down steep terrain, you don't want the jack to be taken out. So as close to the rear axle as you can and as high up as possible that's reasonable is the best. But as you can see, I have a door here. So what we've done to avoid hitting the door, or where this mount is for this step, we've actually mounted this jack on the inside of the chassis. So instead of mounting on the outside, we've gone behind it on the inside, and that means that when it swings up, the jack will not hit this right here. That'll swing directly up out of the way and avoid hitting that step. That's one thing to consider before you start picking which bracket you're going to use, is where is this jack going to swing? Rule of thumb, you're looking at a maximum of 650 mil wide. That's if you have full extensions in the jack. So just keep note of that before you pick what bracket type you want. Where will this jack be sitting and how is it going to swing? So I know I'm not going to hit anything. So in regards to positioning of the jacks, we don't set them at the same place as the stabilizer legs. As you might know, in most vans, the stabilizer legs sit pretty far forward, sometimes even further, like on this little cross section here. We actually want ours sitting a little bit further back, preferably right at the join. You see the A-frame starts here and it goes in. We actually want to be here on this section going back, preferably here, or you could go a little bit further forward depending on how much space you have to work with, how much clearance. But the reason why you don't want to go further forward is because when the jack, specifically on the back, when it's at a further rear or forward point, when you are not completely parallel to the ground, you will see that more on the corners. So for example, if we have the nose of the caravan slightly down and this jack is always all the way at the front, it might hit the ground. Whereas if it's closer to the axle, the chance of it hitting the ground is not going to be as high. So we won't have to adjust our jockey wheel as much when they're more centered to the van mass. So we have three bracket types. This one is the underslung, so it means your jack will go directly underneath the chassis and that bolts onto the chassis like a clamp. Then we have the 45 mil offset, which just sits it up just 45 mil from the bottom of the chassis, as you can see there. Same thing, clamps onto the chassis, but then jack gets just out of the way. And that's perfect for a van that is quite low to the ground. You can have that little bit of offset so it can sit just high enough so you get enough ground clearance. And then we have this one here. As you can see though, this space here from the chassis is actually larger. So those two brackets were for 100 mil chassis. This is for 150 mil. So you actually need a larger chassis area to be able to fit this one, but it's bigger again. So it's actually 95 mil offset. So it means your jack's going to be sitting quite nice along the side of the chassis. It should only be sitting down about 50 mil below the chassis with this bracket. And as you can see with this one, as I said, 45 offset, this one's going to be sitting about 100 mil below the chassis when it's installed with the jack. And with this one, about 150 mil below the chassis when it's installed directly underneath in the stowaway position. So we also have these 50mm RHS spacers. So what this does, it goes in between your bracket and your jack to set it offset at 50mm lower to the ground if your van is really high. So this is another thing to consider when you are setting up your jacks and what brackets to use when you're doing your measurements. As I said before, the jack, in the large jack specifically, in its retracted smallest configuration is 375mm. It can extend out to 500mm, and I'll show you in a second how to do that. So this is the jack, as I said, at 375 in its retracted configuration and no extensions put in. Now we have specific extensions that you can slide into this base plate here. So we have the 20mm shelf. This has to be the furthest one down, so closest to the sensor, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. We have 40mm, 20mm, and also 10mm spacers that can adjust up to 120mm extra extension. So you can only do 120mm more, which brings it out to about 500mm or 495 in the retracted position. So what you have to do is take the pins out of this jack and then slides up like so. We can then put in our desired spacers. For this one I'm putting a 40, 110, and then a 20. So right there we're doing about 70mm. But as I said, this shelf piece, it's got a bar on it and this limit switch cap on it. This has to be the last one you put on, otherwise this jack sensor will never be pressed in correctly. So we put in all the spacers we want, then the last one is that shelf, then it goes back on, and as you see I've added extensions to that jack. So you can do this up to 120mm extra, which gives you closed length. We can call it a closed length of retracted in this position of a 495 plus a 50mm spacer that you saw before, which will give us an extra 50mm again. So that kind of gives you, working with that and working with our foot to ground measurements that we were talking about earlier as well, that gives you your total chassis to ground measurements with the offset bracket as well, to figure out in between that zone what can I work with and what is going to work and how do I adjust to get to that perfect ground clearance. Join back next time for some more tips and tricks.